Most people, when asked what the internet is, will give the same answer. It is a tool. It is a technology. It is something you use. You open an app, look something up, send a message, buy a thing, close the browser, and get on with your day. The internet, on this view, belongs in the same conceptual category as electricity or the postal service. A piece of useful plumbing in the background, helpful when needed and forgettable when not. This is the common sense description, and it is the one under which almost all public discussion of the subject is conducted. It is also, I want to argue, substantially wrong. The internet is no longer a tool in any meaningful sense. It has become an economic system in its own right, with its own productive infrastructure, its own circulation of value, and its own distinctive pattern of who benefits and who does not. Continuing to describe it as a tool is a bit like describing the Industrial Revolution as a clever new kind of machine. Technically accurate at the level of individual parts, badly scaled to the phenomenon as a whole, and incapable of bringing any of the important questions into view. The confusion persists partly because this shift has looked nothing like the shifts we remember from school. The Industrial Revolution announced itself in smoke and noise, and in the movement of populations off the land and into factory towns. The digital shift has been quiet. Nothing was demolished. Nothing was replaced in a way that would show up on a satellite photograph. What happened instead was that hundreds of everyday activities quietly migrated, one by one, into a single networked environment. Photography, banking, navigation, shopping, reading, keeping in touch with family, and watching anything. None of the individual migrations felt like a structural event. In aggregate, they amount to one. The object at the center. The clearest way to see what has changed is to look at the object now sitting at the center of daily life. 15 years ago, a mobile phone was a communication device and nothing more. What people carry in their pockets today is something of a different order. It is simultaneously a camera, a bank, a map, a marketplace, an identity document, a payment terminal, an entertainment library, and the primary lens through which the owner participates in public life. Functions that used to belong to distinct industries, each with its own buildings, staff, and physical distribution, now share a single piece of hardware whose specifications the owner neither chose nor negotiated. The phone is not a better version of what Nokia used to make. It is a different category of object, closer in economic weight to a private branch of the public utility system than to a consumer gadget. Once an object of that weight is in daily use by most of the adult population of the planet, the environment around it starts to behave in a particular way. Value starts to circulate through it rather than being produced in discrete transactions and then leaving. Users supply hardware, electricity, bandwidth, attention, and data continuously through the device. The platforms run the software that processes those inputs continuously and returns services in the opposite direction. The flows are not a sequence of separate transactions, they are an ongoing circuit. Value is produced by the circuit running, not by any single moment within it. This is what economists sometimes mean by an ecosystem, though the word has been so overused in technology marketing that it has lost much of its meaning. The older term for it is simply system. The language has fallen behind. The difficulty is that the language we still use for the internet is mostly marketing language, consumers and suppliers, buyers and sellers, services and customers. These words imply discrete transactions between separate parties and assume that whatever happens outside the moment of exchange is economic background noise. Leisure time becomes consumption. Data exhaust becomes negligible. The user is imagined as someone who shows up, receives something, pays for it in money or attention, and leaves. But in a system of the kind the internet has become, there is no leaving. The user is not a visitor. The user is a component, and the system does not function without the user. Describing this arrangement in market language is a bit like describing a coral reef as a successful retail environment for fish. The words are not wrong at the level of individual fish, they miss the thing they are pointing at. Once the internet is seen as a system rather than as a tool, a number of features that would otherwise be puzzling fall into place. One is the peculiar behavior of the largest platform firms. By any traditional measure, Google, Apple, Meta, Amazon, Tesla, and Nvidia are among the most dominant companies in commercial history. Sitting on cash reserves, brand loyalty, and regulatory moats that an industrial-age monopolist would have found difficult to believe. Yet none of them behaves with the settled confidence of a monopolist. They behave instead as if they were in permanent emergency, pouring extraordinary sums into the next model, the next device, the next acquisition, as if standing still for a year would be fatal. This is usually explained as the culture of Silicon Valley or as the temperament of founders. The structural explanation is simpler. These companies do not, in the deep sense, own the infrastructure their businesses depend on. The phones belong to users. The attention belongs to users. The data originates in users' lives. The social graphs are the users' relationships with one another. The platforms coordinate all this, and coordination is genuinely valuable, but coordination without owned infrastructure leaves them exposed. Users can leave. Nokia did not fall because Apple outcompeted it in some boardroom sense, or because regulators intervened, or because a rival government propped up a challenger. Nokia fell because, over the course of a few years, hundreds of millions of ordinary people looked at what had arrived and chose it, and at that point, there was nothing Nokia's scale, cash, patents, or distribution could do. In this kind of system, whoever has the users has the outcome. The giants are not paranoid. They are correctly calibrated to the situation they are in, which is that their position rests on a choice that users make and can unmake every day. Ordinary behavior as production. Another feature that comes into focus is the role of ordinary behavior as a productive input. A person watching an autonomous vehicle navigate an unfamiliar junction is watching the output of billions of miles previously driven by ordinary Tesla owners who were not paid and not consulted. A person using a large language model is using a system trained on text produced by millions of writers who did not know they were training anything. A person browsing a recommendation feed shapes the feed the next user sees through their clicks. Under the Marketan tool description, all of this is invisible because ordinary use is not supposed to be productive. Under the system description, it is the primary mechanism by which the system improves. Leisure time in this structure is no longer the opposite of work. It is the main source of the raw material that the system runs on. This is not a metaphorical claim. The physical world has structure, and the records of human interaction with that structure are what modern machine learning depends on. Mobile internet has made the recording of those interactions continuous and automatic. And it has done so at the scale of most of the planet's adult population. Having seen that, several familiar debates take on a different shape. The worry about a coming useless class, made prominent by Yuval Noah Harari, assumes a world in which fewer and fewer people are needed for production, while more and more are carried along as consumers. The worry is coherent under the old industrial structure. It is less coherent in a system where ordinary participation is itself productive. The question is not whether people are needed, they plainly are, because the system runs on their activity. The question is whether their contribution is recognized. If it is, the supposed useless class turns out to have been productive all along, and what looked like a looming problem of surplus population becomes a question of how the returns from a genuinely distributed form of production should be shared. The AI race, seen from the side. The present race in artificial intelligence can be read along similar lines. The dominant story frames it as a competition between a handful of well-funded laboratories, each building larger models on bigger clusters, with the implication that the winner will be whoever can spend the most on compute. This is a reasonable description of the contest's surface, but it assumes the underlying substrate as given. That substrate is a digital economy full of duplication. Thousands of near-identical apps, hundreds of overlapping payment systems, the same users providing the same information to unconnected companies that do not share it. A great deal of the computing being thrown at the problem is spent on the complexity produced by the fragmentation itself. A cleaner underlying system would require less brute force. Whether the current path is true progress or an expensive workaround for a poorly organized system is a serious question, and it becomes visible only once the system is seen as a system. At present, the question is rarely asked because the tool description does not make room for it. Finance in the wrong category. The same reframing applies to finance, which has an uneasy relationship with the digital economy and has never quite known what to do with it. Traditional finance operates on the basis of debt secured against tangible collateral: land, buildings, equipment, stock. Digital assets fit this logic awkwardly. The value of a network is not the value of its servers. The value of a dataset is not the value of the disks it sits on. As more economic activity has migrated into the networked environment, finance has responded with ever more elaborate forms of credit stacked on ever thinner foundations, and has found itself less able to fund the future in the way it funded the industrial past. A financial system oriented to the system view would look different. Its fundamental instrument would be participation in the long-run value created by the circuit, with returns distributed as the system produces them, rather than debt repaid on an advanced scheduled schedule. Over a long enough horizon, a system of this kind can produce genuine new value at near zero marginal cost, and that expansion can gradually ease the weight of accumulated industrial debt. This is a large claim to make in passing, and I do not intend to defend it here in full. I mention it to indicate how much of the current financial anxiety is an anxiety of category error. The instruments of industrial finance are being applied to a structure they were not designed for and producing results that nobody is particularly happy with. The question that only now exists. Seeing the internet as a system also changes the question of ownership and returns, which is usually treated as a political or ethical matter about which reasonable people can disagree. Under the tool description, the question barely arises, because a tool has a maker and a user, and that is the end of it. Under the system description, the question is unavoidable. If users supply the hardware, the data, the attention, and the behavior that make the system run, and if the system runs continuously on those inputs rather than on any discrete transaction, then a flow of returns almost entirely to the platforms that coordinate the system is a structural anomaly, not a natural arrangement. It is a particular arrangement, settled early by interested parties under conditions that no longer apply. Other arrangements are possible, and once the system is clearly understood, the case for the current one weakens. The details of what might replace it are a subject for another discussion. The point here is that the question exists at all, and only once the system is seen as a system. Nothing has to be imposed. None of this requires anyone to impose anything. The internet reached its current form through the accumulated choices of hundreds of millions of individual users, not through top-down design, and the next phase will work the same way. What moves systems of this kind is not legislation, or not primarily, it is recognition. Once enough people can see the structure they are inside, their behavior adjusts to it, and the system adjusts to them. The first phase of the internet was defined by the idea of free sharing, in which access was open and the question of who benefited from the shared activity was suspended. That phase is ending because the question has become too large to suspend. The phase that follows will be shaped by how clearly and how soon the underlying structure is described in ordinary language that ordinary users can recognize as accurate. Once someone has seen that the internet is a system rather than a tool, it is difficult to unsee, and each person who sees it makes it slightly harder for the next person not to see it. This is the unusual thing about a system that runs on attention. It cannot indefinitely suppress the spread of an accurate description of itself, because an accurate description of itself is exactly the kind of thing it is built to circulate. The internet is not a tool. It is a system that most of us help run every day, without being asked to, and without much reason to think of ourselves in those terms. The useful place to begin is to start.